My name is Marcus Thornwood, and this is the story of how I returned to my ancestral home after 15 years abroad, only to find that a self-appointed HOA tyrant named Patricia Whitmore had turned my peaceful valley into her personal dictatorship, completely unaware that I owned every single acre she was standing on. It all started on a humid Tuesday morning in late August when I drove my weathered Land Rover down the winding mountain road that led into Thornwood Valley, a place I hadn't seen since my grandfather's funeral 15 years prior, when I was just 23 years old and freshly graduated from college, with a degree in environmental engineering and a burning desire to see the world beyond these ancient hills. The valley looked almost exactly as I remembered it, trolling green hills dotted with wildflowers, the crystal-clear Thornwood River snaking through the center like a silver ribbon, and about 40 homes scattered across the landscape, a mix of old family homesteads and newer constructions that had popped up during my absence. My grandfather, Elijah Thornwood, had been the patriarch of this valley for over 60 years, a man who believed in freedom, privacy, and the right of every person to live their life without interference from busybodies and bureaucrats, which is why he had always refused to establish a homeowners association despite the suggestions from some of the newer residents, who moved in during the 1980s looking for that suburban structure they were accustomed to. When he passed away, he left everything to my all 8,000 acres of Thornwood Valley, including the mineral rights, water rights, and every road, trail, and pathway that connected the scattered homes, making me one of the largest private landowners in the entire state. Though I had been too young and too eager to travel to appreciate what that truly meant, I had spent the last 15 years working on conservation projects across 6 continents, from the Amazon rainforest to the Australian outback, living out of tents and hostels, sending most of my salary back to a trust fund managed by my grandfather's longtime attorney, Jacob Richardson, who handled all the property taxes, maintenance, and leasing agreements with the residents who lived on my land. The arrangement was simple. The original families who had lived in the valley for generations paid a nominal annual lease fee of $1 per year as a symbolic gesture, while newer residents paid market trade leases that were still considerably below what they would pay anywhere else, with the understanding that they were stewards of the land, not owners, and that they would maintain their properties and respect the natural environment. I had been content to let Jake handle everything while I pursued my passion for environmental restoration, but then I received a series of increasingly urgent emails from him over the course of 3 months, emails that painted a disturbing picture of what had been happening in my absence. And that's what finally brought me home. According to Jake's emails, about 7 years ago, a woman named Patricia Whitmore and her husband, Gerald, had moved into one of the newer homes on the eastern ridge of the valley, a modern construction with solar panels and a manicured lawn that stood out like a sore thumb among the rustic cabins and farmhouses that characterized the rest of the community. Patricia was a retired corporate executive from some pharmaceutical company in Boston, one of those people who had climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on everyone beneath her, and she apparently couldn't turn off that domineering instinct even in retirement. Within 6 months of moving in, she had started attending the informal community gatherings that the valley residents held once a month at the old community barn, meetings that were traditionally casual affairs where neighbors caught up, discussed shared concerns like road maintenance or fire prevention, and organized the annual harvest festival that had been a tradition since the 1950s. Patricia had apparently decided that these meetings were too disorganized, too casual, and too ineffective, and she had appointed herself the unofficial leader, creating agendas, taking minutes, and gradually introducing more and more rules and regulations that she insisted were for the good of the community. At first, her suggestions seemed reasonable, enough: organizing a volunteer fire brigade, establishing a community emergency fund, creating a phone tree for weather emergencies. But then she started proposing aesthetic guidelines, noise ordinances, and property maintenance standards that went far beyond what any reasonable person would consider necessary for a rural mountain community. The real turning point, according to Jake, came about 4 years ago when Patricia discovered that there was no formal homeowners association governing the valley, which in her mind was an unconscionable oversight that needed to be corrected immediately. She had apparently spent decades living in HOA-governed communities and couldn't fathom a world where people were simply trusted to maintain their properties and be good neighbors without a codified set of rules and a governing board to enforce them. So she did what people like Patricia always do: she created one unilaterally, drawing up bylaws, electing herself president in an election that only she and 3 of her closest allies voted in, and beginning to issue violation notices to residents whose properties didn't meet her newly established standards. The problem was that Patricia had no legal authority whatsoever to do any of this, since an HOA requires the consent of property owners to be established, and none of the residents actually owned their properties. I did, and I had certainly never consented to the creation of any homeowners association on my land. But Patricia either didn't know this or didn't care, and she had spent the last 4 years acting as though she had been officially appointed the supreme ruler of Thornwood Valley, sending out violation notices for everything from lawn height to paint colors, imposing fines that had no legal standing, and even going so far as to place liens on properties which were invalid and unenforceable but scared several elderly residents who didn't understand their rights. When people refused to pay her fictional fines, Jake had tried to intervene multiple times, sending Patricia cease and desist letters explaining that she had no legal authority to operate an HOA on property she didn't own, but she had dismissed his letters as irrelevant, claiming that squatters' rights and common law gave her the authority she needed, legal concepts she clearly didn't understand but wielded like weapons against anyone who challenged her. The situation had escalated dramatically about 6 months before I returned, when Patricia decided that the old community barn, a historic structure that had been built in 1923 and had hosted everything from barn dances to wedding receptions for a century, needed to be demolished because it was an eyesore and didn't meet her vision for what Thornwood Valley should look like, which apparently involved a lot more stucco and a lot less weathered wood. She had actually hired a demolition company and scheduled them to tear down the barn, completely ignoring the fact that she had no ownership rights to it and no authority to make such decisions. And it was only Jake's last-minute intervention with a temporary restraining order that stopped the demolition crew from reducing a century of history to rubble. That was when Jake sent me the email that finally got my attention, the one with the subject line, "You need to come home now," and after 15 years of wandering the world, I finally booked a flight back to the United States, rented a Land Rover, and started the long drive up into the mountains to reclaim my valley from a woman who had apparently forgotten that tyrants eventually meet their match. As I drove through the valley that first morning, I couldn't help but notice the changes that had occurred during my absence, changes that bore Patricia's fingerprints all over them. Several of the older homes had been painted in what appeared to be approved neutral colors, beiges and grays that looked completely out of place against the natural landscape, and many of the ones' yards had been transformed into sterile, manicured lawns that would have been more appropriate in a suburban subdivision than a mountain valley. There were signs everywhere, professionally printed signs that read Thornwood Valley HOA, maintaining community standards since 2019, and listed a phone number for reporting violations, signs that I knew I had never authorized and that had been installed on my property without my permission. I passed by the community barn, which thankfully was still standing, though I noticed that someone had put up a chain-link fence around it with a sign declaring it condemned and unsafe for occupancy, neither of which was true based on the structural survey Jake had commissioned just 3 months earlier. My destination was the old Thornwood family estate, the original homestead that my great-great-grandfather had built in 1887 when he first settled the valley, a sprawling 3-story Victorian mansion constructed from local stone and timber that sat on a hill overlooking the entire valley like a sentinel watching over its domain. The house had been maintained by a local caretaker named Mrs. Ethel Morrison, a woman who had worked for my grandfather for 40 years and who Jake had kept on the payroll to ensure that the property didn't fall into disrepair during my absence, and I was looking forward to seeing her familiar face and hearing her perspective on what had been happening in the valley. As I pulled up the long driveway, lined with ancient oak trees that my great-great-grandfather had planted himself, I felt a surge of emotion that surprised me. This was home in a way that no tent in the Amazon or hostel in Bangkok had ever been, and I realized that I had been away for too long. I parked in front of the house, grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat, and was walking up the stone steps to the front porch when I heard a car door slam behind me and a shrill voice call out, excuse me, you cannot be here." I turned to see a woman in her early 60s climbing out of a white Lexus SUV, dressed in what I can only describe as affluent, suburban, casual, expensive yoga pants, a designer fleece vest, and sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. She was marching toward me with the confident stride of someone who was absolutely certain of their authority and completely unprepared for the possibility that they might be wrong. And I knew immediately, even before she opened her mouth again, that this was Patricia Whitmore, the woman who had spent the last 4 years pretending to be the queen of my valley. "Can I help you?" I asked politely, though I already knew this conversation was going to be anything but pleasant based on the expression on her face, which somehow managed to combine indignation, suspicion, and self-righteousness into one perfectly punchable smirk. "Yes, you absolutely can help me by explaining what you're doing here," Patricia said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only people who have never been truly challenged can muster. "This property has been abandoned for years, and as the president of the Thornwood Valley Homeowners Association, I am responsible for securing and maintaining all abandoned properties in our community until such time as ownership can be properly established." I almost laughed out loud at that statement, which was so legally absurd that I wondered if Patricia had gotten her understanding of property law from watching too many TV dramas. But I managed to keep my expression neutral as I responded, "I appreciate your concern, but this property hasn't been abandoned. It's been maintained by a caretaker and is very much occupied. At least as of right now, since I'm moving back in." Patricia's eyes narrowed behind her expensive sunglasses, and she looked me up and down in a way that made it clear she found me lacking in whatever criteria she used to judge people, probably because I was wearing faded jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and hiking boots that had seen 6 continents worth of mud, rather than the kind of expensive casual where that seemed to be the uniform in her world. "And you are?" she asked, her tone making it clear that she expected me to justify my existence to her, which was rich considering she was standing uninvited on my property. "Marcus Tahuji," I said simply, watching her face for any sign of recognition. But there was nothing. The name that should have meant everything in this valley apparently meant nothing to her, which told me just how disconnected Patricia was from the history and reality of the place she claimed to govern. "Well, Mr. Thornwood," she said, emphasizing my name in a way that made it sound like an insult, "I'm afraid that simply claiming to be related to the original Thornwood family doesn't give you squatters' rights to this property. The Thornwood estate has been abandoned for over a decade, and under the HOA bylaws that I personally drafted, abandoned properties revert to community control after 7 years, which means that this house is now under the jurisdiction of the Homeowners Association, and you are trespassing." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the sheer absurdity of what she had just said. The idea that she could simply write bylaws that would allow her to seize property she didn't own. But I could see that she was completely serious, that she genuinely believed she had the legal authority to do what she was claiming. "That's an interesting legal theory," I said, keeping my voice calm and pleasant, "but I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. I'm not claiming squatters' rights. I'm the actual legal owner of this property, and I've been the legal owner for the last 15 years, ever since my grandfather passed away and left everything to me in his will, a will that was properly probated and recorded with the county, making my ownership a matter of public record." I could see the gears turning in Patricia's head as she processed this information, but instead of backing down or apologizing, she doubled down, which I was learning was her signature move. "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "If you were really the owner, you would have been here maintaining the property and paying your HOA dues, which by the way are currently 7 years in arrears at $500 per year, meaning you owe the association $3,500 in back dues, plus late fees and interest, which brings your total to just over $6,000. And if you can't provide proof of ownership right here and right now, I'm going to have to call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." This was the moment when I realized that Patricia wasn't just a busybody or a control freak. She was completely delusional, living in a fantasy world where she had powers and authorities that existed nowhere outside her own mind. And I understood why Jake had been so frustrated in his attempts to deal with her, because you can't reason with someone who has constructed an entire alternate reality where they're the hero and everyone else is either a subordinate or an enemy. Pulled out my phone and opened up the Photos app, where I had stored copies of all the important documents Jake had sent me, including the deed to the property, my grandfather's will, the probate documents, and the survey map showing the exact boundaries of my 8,000 acres. "Here's the deed," I said, holding up my phone so Patricia could see the document, recorded with the county clerk on March 15, 2010, showing that I, Marcus James Thornwood, am the sole owner of this property and approximately 8,000 surrounding acres, which includes pretty much everything you can see from here to the horizon. And here's my grandfather's will, properly executed and probated, leaving everything to me. And here's my driver's license, showing that I am indeed Marcus James Thornwood. So now that we've established my ownership, let me make a few things clear. First, I don't owe you or your fictional homeowners association a single penny. because you have no legal authority to collect dues from anyone, let alone from me, the person who actually owns all the land you're standing on. Second, this house has never been abandoned, it's been maintained by a paid caretaker, and the property taxes have been paid in full every single year, which you could verify with a simple call to the county assessor's office if you were interested in facts rather than fantasies. And third, you need to leave my property right now, because you are the one who's trespassing, not me. I expected Patricia to be embarrassed or at least somewhat chastened by this information, but instead, her face turned an impressive shade of red and she actually took a step toward me, her finger pointing at my chest like a weapon. "I don't care what documents you think you have," she said, her voice rising to a near shout. "This valley needs proper governance, and I have worked for years to establish standards and systems that protect property values and maintain community aesthetics. And I am not going to let some wandering hippie who shows up out of nowhere disrupt everything I've built just because he has some dusty old papers that may or may not be legitimate. The HOA board will need to review your documents and verify their authenticity, and until they do, you will follow all community rules and regulations just like everyone else, starting with removing that eyesore of a vehicle from the front of this historic property classic. Cars and vintage vehicles must be stored in closed garages per section 12.4 of the HOA bylaw, and leaving them visible from the road is a violation that will result in a fine of $250 per day. I looked at my Land Rover, which was less than 3 years old and in perfectly good condition, and realized that Patricia's definition of eyesore apparently included anything that wasn't a luxury SUV like her Lexus, and I finally understood why so many of the valley residents had been intimidated by her. She was relentless, shameless, and completely impervious to reason or reality. "Patricia," I said, using her first name deliberately to establish that I didn't recognize her claimed authority. "I'm going to say this one more time, as clearly as I can. There is no legitimate homeowners association in Thornwood Valley. You cannot establish an HOA on property you don't own without the consent of the actual property owner, which you never sought and never received. Every violation notice you've ever sent, every fine you've ever imposed, every lien you've ever filed, all of it is legally meaningless and potentially actionable as harassment. Now, I've just driven 18 hours to get here. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I have a lot of work to do settling back into my home. So I'm going to give you exactly 60 seconds to get back in your car and leave my property before I call the sheriff myself and have you cited for trespassing." Patricia stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through her options, trying to figure out if I was bluffing or if I really had the authority I was claiming. And I could tell the exact moment when she decided that she couldn't back down without losing face, which was apparently more important to her than anything else. "You're making a big mistake," she said, her voice low and threatening. "I have connections in this county. My husband plays golf with the county commissioner and the sheriff, and I am personal friends with 3 lawyers who will be very interested to hear about your attempts to intimidate me and undermine the legitimate governance structure of this community. You may have some old documents that you think prove ownership, but possession is 9/10 of the law, and I have been the de facto authority in this valley for years, which means I have established rights that supersede whatever paperwork you're waving around. This isn't over, Mr. Thornwood, not by a long shot." And with that, she turned and marched back to her Lexus, climbed in, and drove away, but not before rolling down her window to shout, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," which would have been more intimidating if I hadn't already spent the last 15 years dealing with actual threats like armed poachers in Africa and corrupt officials in Southeast Asia, making Patricia's suburban soccer mom tantrum seem almost quaint by comparison. I stood there on my front porch, watching her car disappear down the driveway, and I realized that my peaceful return home was going to be anything but peaceful, because Patricia Whitmore was exactly the kind of person who would burn down the entire valley rather than admit she was wrong, and I was going to have to deal with her sooner or later, preferably before she caused any more damage to my property or my tenants. I grabbed my duffel bag and unlocked the front door, using the key that Jake had mailed me, and stepped inside the house for the first time in 15 years. And I was immediately hit by a wave of nostalgia so powerful it almost knocked me over. The smell of old wood and the faint scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco that still lingered in the air, the way the afternoon light streamed through the stained glass window on the landing, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet. Mrs. Morrison had done an incredible job maintaining the place. Everything was clean and dust-free. The furniture was covered with protective sheets, and there was a welcome basket on the kitchen table with fresh bread, local honey, and a note that said, "Welcome home, Marcus." I'll stop by tomorrow morning to catch you up on everything. Ethel, I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, exploring the house, and reacquainting myself with the valley through the windows that looked out over the landscape I now realized I had desperately missed. And as the sun began to set, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber, I made myself a simple dinner and sat on the back porch, listening to the sounds of the valley crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the trees, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. But I knew that peace wouldn't last, because tomorrow I would have to start dealing with the mess that Patricia had created, and I had a feeling that she was already plotting her next move, probably calling her lawyer and her husband's golf buddies and anyone else she thought might help her maintain her grip on the power she had illegally assumed. Little did she know that she had just picked a fight with someone who had spent 15 years learning how to deal with much more dangerous adversaries than a suburban tyrant with delusions of grandeur, and I was about to show her exactly what happens when you try to claim ownership of something that was never yours to begin with. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of someone knocking on my front door, and when I opened it, I found Mrs. Morrison standing there with a basket of fresh muffins and a thermos of coffee, her weathered face breaking into a huge smile when she saw me. "Marcus, oh, it's so good to see you, child," she said. And even though I was 38 years old, I would always be a child to Mrs. Morrison, who had known me since I was in diapers. She came inside and we sat in the kitchen, and over coffee and muffins, she filled me in on everything that had been happening in the valley during my absence, painting a picture that was even worse than what Jake's emails had described. According to Ethel, Patricia had become increasingly tyrannical over the past few years, targeting the older residents with violation notices for things like peeling paint or overgrown gardens, things that would have been ignored in the past because everyone understood that elderly people on fixed incomes can't always afford constant maintenance, and that a little wildness in the garden was part of the valley's charm. But Patricia didn't care about charm or tradition or the fact that these people had lived in the valley for decades. She cared about her vision of what the valley should look like, which was apparently a sterile corporate-approved aesthetic that would have made a prison warden proud. Several elderly residents had actually moved away, selling their leases back to me at a loss, though Jake made sure they were fairly compensated, because they couldn't handle the constant harassment from Patricia and her HOA board, which consisted of 3 other newcomers who had moved in during the past decade and shared Patricia's vision of turning Thornwood Valley into an exclusive, highly regulated community. Even worse, Patricia had been actively discouraging families from moving into the valley if they didn't meet her standards, which apparently meant they needed to be wealthy, white, and willing to bow to her authority, and she had actually blocked several lease applications by claiming that the HOA had veto power over new residents, another completely fictional authority that she had simply invented out of thin air. Ethel told me about the Johnsons, a young black family who had been interested in leasing one of the vacant properties and had been excited about raising their kids in such a beautiful, natural setting, only to have Patricia show up at their viewing appointment and inform them that the valley wasn't a good fit for their family, using coded language that made her discriminatory intent crystal clear without quite crossing the line into explicitly illegal statements. The Johnsons had filed a complaint with the State Fair Housing Authority, but Patricia had claimed that she was just offering friendly advice and that the Johnsons were being oversent. And since she technically didn't have any legal authority to block anyone from moving in, the complaint had gone nowhere, though Jake had made sure the Johnsons were offered the lease they wanted and they had moved in despite Patricia's objections, becoming some of her most vocal critics in the process. Then there was the situation with Tom Reeves, a veteran who had lived in the valley for 30 years and had a small auto repair shop on his property where he fixed cars for neighbors at cost, a valuable service in a rural area where the nearest mechanic was 20 miles away. Patricia had decided that the auto shop was commercial activity that violated the residential zoning of the valley, never mind that there was no formal zoning since the entire valley was private property, and I had never established any restrictions on what tenants could do on their leased land as long as it wasn't harmful to the environment. She had sent Tom dozens of violation notices demanding that he cease his illegal commercial operation, and when he refused, she had actually reported him to the county zoning board, which had investigated and determined that since the property was private and there were no zoning restrictions in place, Tom was perfectly within his rights to operate his shop. But Patricia hadn't let that stop. Hershey had then started a campaign to get Tom evicted, sending letters to Jake claiming that Tom was running a nuisance that was lowering property values and demanding that his lease be terminated. Letters that Jake had properly ignored but that had caused Tom significant stress and anxiety about losing his home. These stories went on, each one more infuriating than the last. And by the time Ethel finished her update, I was absolutely furious at what Patricia had been allowed to get away with. And I was kicking myself for staying away so long and letting this situation develop unchecked. Why didn't anyone fight back? I asked Ethel, genuinely puzzled by how Patricia had managed to intimidate so many people into compliance. Why didn't they just tell her to go to hell and ignore her violation notices? Ethel sighed and refilled our coffee cups before answering. Most people did ignore her at first, but Patricia is relentless. Marcus, she'll send notice after notice, then she'll show up at your door. Then she start calling and emailing. And she's got all the time in the world because she's retired and has nothing better to do than harass people who just want to live their lives in peace. And some of the older folks, they got scared when she started talking about liens and legal action. Even though Jake sent around letters explaining that she didn't have the authority to do any of that, people don't want to get involved in legal battles, especially when they're on fixed incomes and can't afford lawyers. So it was just easier to comply with her demands or move away. And the newer residents, a lot of them actually like what Patricia's doing. They moved out here from cities and suburbs where HOAs are normal, and they think having rules and standards is a good thing. So they support her even though they don't understand that she's making it all up as she goes along. I shook my head in frustration, understanding now how Patricia had managed to establish her little fiefdom. She had exploited people's fear of legal consequences, their desire to avoid conflict, and the general ignorance about property rights and HOA law that most people have, and she had filled the vacuum of leadership that had existed since my grandfather's death and my long absence. Well, that ends now, I told Ethel. I'm back, and I'm going to make it very clear to Patricia and everyone else that there is no HOA in Thornwood Valley. There never was, and there never will be as long as I own this land. And if Patricia wants to fight about it, I'm more than happy to let the lawyers sort it out. Though I suspect that once she realizes she has no legal leg to stand on, and that continuing to harass my tenants could open her up to serious liability, she backed down. Ethel gave me a look that suggested she wasn't so sure about that, and she said, Marcus, I've known Patricia for 7 years now, and I can tell you that woman doesn't back down from anything. She's got an ego the size of Texas, and she's convinced herself that she's some kind of savior who rescued this valley from chaos and disorder. You embarrassed her yesterday by showing up and challenging her authority, and she's going to come at you with everything she's got, legal or not. You need to be prepared for this to get ugly, because Patricia doesn't play fair and she doesn't care who gets hurt as long as she wins. I appreciated Ethel's warning, but I wasn't too concerned. I had dealt with warlords in Sudan, corrupt mining executives in Brazil, and poachers in Tanzania who would shoot you dead for interfering with their operations. So a retired corporate executive with a god complex didn't seem like much of a threat. But I also respected Ethel's judgment, so I decided to take her advice seriously and prepare for the possibility that Patricia might escalate things beyond what any reasonable person would consider appropriate. After Ethel left, I spent the rest of the morning calling Jake and bringing him up to speed on my arrival and my encounter with Patricia, and he was relieved to hear that I was finally taking an active role in managing the property, but also worried about how Patricia would respond to my presence. She's going to lawyer up, Jake predicted, and her lawyer is going to send you threatening letters demanding that you recognize the HOA and pay back dues and submit to their authority. And it's all going to be complete bullshit, but it'll be official-looking bullshit on law firm letterhead, and they'll hope that scares you into backing down. Let them send whatever they want, I told him. I've got 15 years of tax records, maintenance records, and lease payments showing continuous ownership and management of this property, plus the original deed and survey maps and everything else we need to prove that I'm the sole owner and that no HOA was ever legitimately established. If Patricia's lawyer wants to take this to court, we'll be happy to embarrass them in front of a judge who will not be amused by their frivolous claims. Jake agreed and said he would prepare a comprehensive response to whatever legal threats Patricia sent my way. And he also suggested that I consider holding a community meeting to introduce myself to the residents, many of whom I had never met since they had moved in during my absence, and to clarify the actual legal situation regarding property, ownership, and the fictional HOA. I thought that was an excellent idea, and we agreed that Jake would send out notices to all the residents inviting them to a meeting at the community barn the following Saturday, where I would introduce myself, explain my plans for the valley, and make it absolutely clear that Patricia's HOA had no legal authority whatsoever. Over the next few days, I spent my time reacquainting myself with the valley, driving around the property, meeting with tenants, and assessing what needed to be done to maintain and improve the land that I had inherited but never fully appreciated, until now. I met the Johnsons, the family that Patricia had tried to discourage from moving in, and they were wonderful people. Michael was a software engineer who worked remotely. His wife Aisha was a teacher who had gotten a job at the local elementary school, and their 2 kids were bright, curious, and clearly thriving in the freedom and beauty of the valley. They told me about their experiences with Patricia, how she had tried to enforce all sorts of ridiculous rules on them, from the color they could paint their front door to the hours when their kids were allowed to play outside, and how they had simply ignored her because they had done their research and knew she had no legal authority. We were ready to fight if we had to, Michael told me, because we loved this place the moment we saw it, and we weren't going to let some racist Karen drive us away just because she didn't like having black neighbors. But it's been exhausting, constantly having to deal with her showing up uninvited and leaving threatening notes and calling the sheriff to report us for imaginary violations. We're just glad you're back, because maybe now she'll finally back off. I assured them that Patricia would indeed be backing off, whether she liked it or not, and I made a mental note to make sure the Johnsons were protected from any future harassment. I also met Tom Reeves, the veteran with the auto shop, and he was exactly the kind of person you'd want as a neighbor, hardworking, humble, and generous with his time and skills. He had fixed my Land Rover's squeaky brakes for free, refusing to accept payment and saying it was the least he could do for someone who was finally standing up to Patricia. That woman has made my life hell for the past 2 years, Tom told me as he worked on my vehicle. I served 2 tours in Iraq. I've got PTSD and some other issues, and working on cars is therapeutic for MIT, keeps me sane and gives me a sense of purpose. But Patricia doesn't care about that. All she cares about is her precious property values and her vision of what the valley should look like. And apparently that vision doesn't include a veteran with a small repair shop helping out his neighbors. I was seriously considering moving away, even though I love this place, because I just couldn't take the constant harassment anymore. But now that you're back, maybe things will finally change. I promised Tom that things would absolutely change, and I told him that not only was he welcome to continue operating his shop, but I was going to put it in writing in his lease agreement so that Patricia or anyone else could never question his right to do so. These conversations, repeated with various residents over the course of several days, reinforced my determination to put an end to Patricia's reign of terror once and for all, and I was actually looking forward to the community meeting on Saturday, where I would have the opportunity to set the record straight in front of everyone. Saturday arrived, and I got to the community barn early to help set up chairs and make sure everything was ready for what I expected would be a well-attended meeting, and I wasn't disappointed by the time the meeting was scheduled to start at 2 p.m. There were at least 60 people packed into the barn, including all the longtime residents, most of the newer ones, and of course Patricia Whitmore and her HOA board members, who had positioned themselves in the front row like they were the hosts of the event, rather than unwelcome guests at a party they hadn't been invited to. Jake was there as well, armed with a briefcase full of documents and a grim expression that suggested he was prepared for this to get contentious. And Ethel Morrison had brought homemade cookies and lemonade because she believed that every community gathering should involve food, regardless of how serious the business at hand might be. I stood at the front of the barn looking out at all these faces, some familiar from my childhood, some completely new, all of them looking at me with curiosity and hope and maybe a little bit of skepticism about whether I was really going to do anything about Patricia or if this was just going to be more empty talk. And I realized that this was my moment to reclaim not just my property but the community that my grandfather had spent his entire life nurturing and protecting. I cleared my throat and began speaking, and the room fell silent except for the sound of a few kids playing quietly in the back corner. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Thornwood, and I'm the grandson of Elijah Thornwood, who many of you knew and loved. My grandfather passed away 15 years ago and left this valley, all 8,000 acres of it, to me. And I'm here today to address some serious issues that have developed during my absence. Issues that involve someone in this room claiming authority they never had and terrorizing residents who have every right to live in peace on the land they lease from me. I saw Patricia stiffen in her front row seat, her face already starting to flush red, but I continued before she could interrupt. I've spent the last week talking to many of you, hearing your stories about violation notices, fines, threats of liens, harassment, and intimidation, all coming from a so-called homeowners association that was never legally established. and has absolutely no authority over anyone in this valley. I want to make this crystal clear, so there's no confusion going forward. There is no legitimate HOA in Thornwood Valley. There never has been, and as long as I own this land, there never will be. Patricia Whitmore has been operating under the delusion that she has the right to govern this community, but the truth is that she's been running a scam, pure and simple, inventing rules and fines and threatening people with legal action that she has no power to take. Every violation notice she's sent, every fine she's imposed, every lien she's filed, all of it is legally meaningless and potentially constitutes harassment, and if she continues down this path, she will face serious legal consequences. That's when Patricia shot to her feet, her face now completely red, her hands shaking with rage, and she pointed her finger at me like she was casting a curse. How dare you come in here and slander me in front of the entire community? I have done nothing but work tirelessly to improve this valley, to establish standards and order where there was only chaos, to protect property values and ensure that Thornwood Valley becomes the kind of place where decent people want to live. You abandoned this place for 15 years, and now you show up out of nowhere and expect everyone to just bow down to you because you have some old piece of paper that says you own the land. Well, I have news for you. Marcus ownership comes with responsibility, and you abdicated that responsibility the moment you ran off to play Indiana Jones in whatever third world countries you were hiding in while the rest of us were here building a real community. The HOA board and I have invested thousands of hours and our own personal money into improving this valley, and we're not going to let some absentee landlord waltz in and destroy everything we've built. The room erupted in murmurs, and several people actually applauded Patricia's speech, which surprised me until I realized that these were the newer residents, the ones who had moved in during the past decade and had been recruited by Patricia specifically because they supported her vision of a highly regulated, HOA-governed community. But there were far more people in the room who were not applauding, people who were nodding along with what I had said and looking at Patricia with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright hostility. And I knew that the community was deeply divided, which was exactly what Patricia had done. She had created an us versus them mentality where you were either with her or against her, and she had used that division to maintain her power. I waited for the noise to die down before responding, keeping my voice calm and measured even though I wanted to match Patricia's volume and fury. Patricia, I understand that you believe you've been helping this community, and I'm sure that in your mind, everything you've done has been for the greater good. But good intentions don't give you the legal right to impose rules on property you don't own. To collect fines you have no authority to collect, or to threaten people with legal action you have no power to take. The fact that I was absent for 15 years doesn't change the fundamental reality that I own this land. I pay the taxes on this land, I maintain this land, and I decide what rules, if any, govern the people who lease property from me. And I've decided that the rules my grandfather established are the only rules we need. Maintain your property in reasonable condition. Don't damage the environment, don't harm your neighbors, and otherwise live your life however you see fit. That's it. No paint color restrictions, no lawn height requirements, no bans on auto repair shops or kids playing outside after 8 p.m. or any of the other ridiculous regulations you've invented. If people want to live in an HOA-governed community with hundreds of rules and restrictions, there are thousands of such communities across this country where they're welcome to move. But Thornwood Valley is not one of them, and it never will be. Patricia was practically vibrating with rage at this point, and she looked around the room as if expecting everyone to rise up in her defense. But the support she was looking for wasn't materializing the way she had hoped. "This is insane," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're going to let this valley turn into a slum, a rural ghetto where anything goes and nobody maintains any standards. Do you people not understand what will happen to your property values when there are no rules? When someone can paint their house bright purple or park rusted-out cars on their lawn or run a commercial business out of their garage, your homes will become worthless, and you'll have Marcus Thornwood to thank for it when you can't sell your properties for a fraction of what you paid for them." Tom Reeves stood up from his seat in the middle of the barn, his weathered face set in an expression of quiet anger that was somehow more intimidating than Patricia's theatrical rage. "First of all, Patricia, we don't own our properties, we lease them from market, so we're not worried about resale values because there's nothing to resell. Second, I've been running my commercial business out of my garage for 30 years, long before you moved here, and somehow the valley survived just fine. And third, the only person who's made anyone's life miserable around here is you, with your constant harassment and your fake violation notices and your threats to take away people's homes if they don't comply with your made-up rules. So maybe instead of worrying about what Marcus is going to do, you should start worrying about what's going to happen to you if you keep harassing people who are protected by actual laws, not the fantasy laws you've invented in your head." The room erupted in applause, and I could see Patricia's face going through a whole spectrum of emotions: shock, betrayal, fury, and finally something that looked almost like fear as she realized that the community support she had counted on was evaporating before her eyes. She turned back to me, and I could see her mind working frantically to find some angle, some argument that would salvage her position. And then her expression changed to something calculating and mean. "You want to talk about legal authority," she said, her voice dropping to a more controlled but no less hostile tone. "Fine, let's talk about the fact that you've been an absentee landlord for 15 years, which under the laws of this state can be grounds for adverse possession claims. Let's talk about the fact that I have been openly and notoriously maintaining community standards for 7 years, which is the exact time frame required for adverse possession in this jurisdiction. Let's talk about the fact that my lawyer, a very expensive, very competent lawyer, I might add, has advised me that I have a viable claim to at least partial ownership of community property based on my continuous and exclusive control of community affairs during your absence. So before you start throwing around accusations and making threats, you might want to consider that you're not the only one with legal options here. And if you push me, I will absolutely pursue every legal remedy available to me, including filing an adverse possession claim that will tie this property up in court for years and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees even if you ultimately win." I actually had to suppress a laugh. At this latest legal theory Patricia had pulled out of thin air, because adverse possession requires, among other things, that the possession be hostile to the owner's interests and without the owner's permission. And since I had been actively managing the property through Jake, collecting lease payments, paying taxes, and maintaining the land, there was absolutely no way any court would ever find that Patricia had met the requirements for adverse possession. But I could see that some of the less legally sophisticated people in the room were looking worried, as if Patricia might actually have a case, and I knew I needed to shut this down quickly and definitively. "Patricia," I said, pulling out my phone and opening up the document folder where Jake had stored all the relevant records, "adverse possession requires that your possession of the property be continuous, exclusive, open, and notorious, adverse to the owner's interests, and under a claim of right for a period of 7 years in this state. Let me explain why you don't meet any of those requirements. First, you've never been in possession of the property I have, through my property manager and attorney, who have been collecting lease payments, paying taxes, performing maintenance, and managing tenant relations continuously for the entire 15 years I've been away, as evidenced by these financial records, tax receipts, and maintenance logs that I'd be happy to share with your very expensive lawyer. Second, your possession has not been exclusive, because approximately 40 other households also occupy the property, and more importantly, because I, the actual owner, have maintained continuous legal and financial control of the property through my representatives. Third, while your activities have certainly been open and notorious, believe me, everyone knows what you've been up to, they haven't been adverse to my interests in the legal sense, because adverse possession requires that you be occupying the property in a way that denies the owner their rights. And since you've been paying your lease fees and I've been collecting them, you've actually been acknowledging my ownership the entire time. And fourth, you haven't been acting under a claim of right to the property itself, you've been acting under a claimed right to govern the property, which is not the same thing and doesn't qualify for adverse possession. So please, by all means, have your very expensive lawyer file an adverse possession claim, because I would love to watch a judge laugh it out of court and possibly sanction your lawyer for filing a frivolous lawsuit, which could result in you paying not only your own legal fees, but mine as well. The room had gone completely silent as I delivered this explanation, and I could see Patricia's face cycling through emotions again, finally landing on something that looked like genuine panic as she realized that her legal bluff had been called by someone who actually understood the law. But Patricia was nothing if not persistent, and she latched onto one last, desperate argument. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking now with either rage or fear or both. "Maybe I don't have an adverse possession claim, but you know what I do have? I have documentary evidence of every single code violation, safety hazard, and environmental concern in this valley that you've neglected to address during your 15 years of absence. I have photographs, written reports, and sworn statements from community members documenting everything, from leaking septic systems to dangerous electrical wiring to fire hazards that you've allowed to fester because you couldn't be bothered to actually manage your property. And if you think I won't take all of that evidence to the county health department, the fire marshal, the Environmental Protection Agency, and every other regulatory body that might be interested, you're sadly mistaken. You want to shut down the fine, but I'll make damn sure that every single violation of every single code on this property is investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And when you're facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and remediation costs, maybe you'll wish you'd been a little more cooperative. This was a new tactic, and I had to admit it was more clever than her previous attempts, because even if her documented violations were exaggerated or fabricated, dealing with regulatory investigations would be time-consuming and expensive. And Patricia clearly knew that threatening to unleash a bureaucratic nightmare on me might be more effective than her laughable legal claims. But what Patricia didn't know was that I had spent the last 15 years of my life working with environmental regulations in dozens of countries. I knew more about proper land management than she could ever hope to learn, and I had already reviewed all the inspection reports Jake had commissioned over the years. Reports that showed the property was in excellent condition with no significant code violations or safety hazards. Patricia, I said, pulling up yet another set of documents on my phone, I appreciate your concern for code compliance, and I want to assure you and everyone else here that this property has been regularly inspected and maintained to meet or exceed all applicable codes and regulations. Here are the inspection reports from the last 5 years, conducted by licensed professionals and filed with the appropriate county departments, showing that all septic systems are functioning properly, all structures meet fire safety codes, all electrical systems are up to standard, and all environmental regulations are being followed. If you have evidence of specific violations that these professional inspectors somehow missed, I encourage you to report them to the appropriate authorities, and I'll work with those authorities to address any legitimate concerns. But I think we both know that what you're really talking about is using the threat of regulatory harassment as a weapon to maintain your control over this community. And I want to make something very clear. That kind of behavior crosses the line from annoying to potentially criminal. Filing false reports with regulatory agencies is a crime, and using threats of false reports to extort compliance is also a crime. And if you go down that road, you won't just be dealing with me, you'll be dealing with law enforcement, and I promise you that won't end well for you. I could see Patricia's 3 board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly realizing that they had attached themselves to someone who was willing to cross legal and ethical lines that they weren't prepared to cross. And I wondered how long it would be before they quietly resigned from her fictional board, and tried to distance themselves from the mess she had created. Patricia herself seemed to finally be running out of steam, her bluster deflating as she realized that every argument she made was being systematically dismantled in front of the entire community. And I could see her looking around the room for support that was no longer there, even from the people who had previously been her allies. "This isn't over," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll fight this, I'll fight you, and I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. Someone who doesn't care about this community and only showed up because your property was being threatened." And with that, she gathered her purse and stormed out of the barn, followed reluctantly by her husband Gerald, who had been sitting silently through the entire confrontation looking like he wished he could be anywhere else. And I felt a strange mix of relief and pity watching her go. Relief that she was finally leaving, and pitied that she had invested so much of herself in a delusion that had just been shattered in the most public way possible. After Patricia left, the atmosphere in the barn changed dramatically, like someone had opened all the windows and let fresh air rush in, and people started talking and laughing and asking me questions about my plans for the valley and thanking me for standing up to Patricia and generally expressing relief that the nightmare of the past few years was finally over. I spent the next 2 hours talking to residents, answering questions, listening to concerns, and making it clear that while there would be no HOA, I was absolutely committed to being an active and engaged landlord who would maintain the property, address legitimate problems, and protect the character of the valley that my grandfather had worked so hard to preserve. Several people asked if I was planning to raise lease rates or change the terms of their agreements, and I assured them that the current rates and terms would remain in place for existing residents, though I would be adding explicit protections to new leases to prevent anyone from trying to establish an HOA or harass their neighbors in the future. The Johnsons thanked me profusely for addressing the discrimination they had faced, and I promised them that I would be updating all the Valley policies to explicitly prohibit discrimination and harassment of any kind, with immediate lease termination for anyone who violated those policies. Tom Reeves shook my hand and said, "I never thought I'd see the day when someone would actually stand up to that woman. You're just like your grandfather, Marcus, and I mean that as the highest compliment." As the meeting wound down and people started to leave, Jake pulled me aside and said, "That went better than I expected, but don't think this is over. Patricia's not the type to just accept defeat and go quietly. She's going to regroup and come at you again, probably with a lawyer in tow, and you need to be prepared for that." I told him I understood and asked him to start preparing whatever legal documents we might need to formally dissolve the fictional HOA, issue cease and desist orders to prevent further harassment of residents, and potentially file for a restraining order if Patricia continued her campaign after being clearly told to stop. Jake agreed and said he'd have everything ready within a week, and as I drove home that evening, watching the sun set over the valley that was truly mine now in a way it had never been before, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose that I hadn't felt in years, like I had finally found the place where I was meant to be and the fight I was meant to fight. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new rhythm in Thornwood Valley, a rhythm that felt more like the way things had been during my grandfather's time, when people were free to live their lives without fear of violation, notices, or arbitrary rules imposed by busybodies with too much time on their hands. Patricia had indeed hired a lawyer, a local attorney named Richard Halverson, who was known more for his aggressive marketing than his legal acumen, and Halverson had sent Jake a series of increasingly desperate letters, threatening everything from lawsuits to criminal charges to federal investigations. Letters that Jake described as legal word salad designed to intimidate people who don't know any better. Jake had responded to each letter with calm, professional rebuttals that cited actual case law and statutes, and after about 3 weeks of this back, Halverson apparently advised Patricia that she had no case and that continuing to pursue legal action would only result in her paying both her legal fees and mine when the court inevitably ruled against her and sanctioned her for filing frivolous claims. Patricia had not taken this advice well, according to the Valley Gossip Network that Ethel Morrison kept me plugged into, and she had apparently fired Halverson and started shopping for a new lawyer who would be willing to take her case. But so far she hadn't found anyone willing to stake their professional reputation on her obviously baseless claims. In the meantime, I had been busy making improvements to the valley, fixing roads that needed repair, clearing dead trees that posed fire hazards, and generally doing all the active land management that Patricia had claimed I was neglecting, and I made sure to document everything with photos and reports so that if she did try to file complaints with regulatory agencies, I would have evidence showing that the property was being properly maintained. I also started the process of updating all the lease agreements to include explicit anti-harassment clauses and clear statements that no HOA existed or would be permitted, and I gave every resident the option to sign the new agreement or give 60 days notice and move out, if they preferred to live in an HOA-governed community. And out of the 40 households in the valley, only 3 chose to leave, one of Patricia's board members and 2 other families, who had moved in specifically because they wanted HOA-style governance and regulations. The rest of the residents signed the new agreements enthusiastically, many of them telling me that they felt like they could finally breathe again without Patricia watching their every move and waiting to pounce on the slightest deviation from her arbitrary standards. I also made good on my promise to the Johnsons and added strong anti-discrimination language to all the leases, making it clear that any form of discrimination or harassment based on race, religion, national origin, or any other protected characteristic would result in immediate lease termination. And I made sure this policy was prominently posted in the community barn and sent to every resident so there could be no confusion about where I stood on those issues. But Patricia wasn't done yet, and her next move was one I should have seen coming but somehow didn't. She started a social media campaign to destroy my reputation and drum up support for her cause, creating a Facebook page called Save Thornwood Valley and a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for legal fees to fight against an absentee landlord who wants to turn our beautiful community into a lawless wasteland. The Facebook page was filled with dramatic posts about how I was destroying decades of community progress, putting residents at risk by eliminating safety standards, and allowing discrimination and harassment to flourish, unchecked, all of which were complete fabrications, but were presented with enough of language and emotional appeals that they actually gained some traction, at least among people who didn't know the actual facts of the situation. The GoFundMe campaign was particularly galling because Patricia was asking for $50,000 to defend the community against legal attacks from a wealthy landowner who wants to silence residents and take away their rights, which was such a perfect inversion of reality that I had to admire the sheer audacity of it, even as I was furious about the lies she was spreading. The campaign raised about $12,000 in the first week, mostly from people outside the valley who had been taken in by Patricia's sob story and didn't realize they were funding a harassment campaign against someone who was actually trying to protect residents from a would-be tyrant. Jake advised me to ignore the social media campaign and not engage, saying that responding would only give Patricia more attention and make it look like I was trying to silence her. But I couldn't just sit back and let her spread lies unchallenged. So I decided to create my own social media presence to tell the true story of what had been happening in Thornwood Valley. I created a website called truthAboutThornwood.com, where I posted all the relevant documents, the deed showing my ownership, the inspection reports showing the property was well maintained, the lease agreements showing the reasonable terms I was offering, Jake's letters explaining why the HOA had no legal authority, and testimonials from residents like Tom Reeves and the Johnsons explaining how Patricia's HOA had made their lives miserable. I also posted the full video of the community meeting, which someone had recorded on their phone, so people could see for themselves how Patricia had behaved and what arguments she had made. And I invited anyone who had questions or concerns to contact me directly rather than relying on Patricia's distorted version of events. The website got a lot of traffic, especially after several local news outlets picked up the story and started reporting on the HOA dispute, and public opinion started to shift dramatically once people saw the actual evidence and realized that Patricia was not a heroic defender of community standards but rather a busybody who had appointed herself dictator of property she didn't own. The local news coverage was what finally seemed to break Patricia's spirit, because being portrayed as the villain in multiple news articles and having her claims publicly debunked by reporters who actually did their research was apparently more than her ego could handle. The GoFundMe campaign stopped gaining donations and several people actually demanded refunds once they realized they had been misled about what they were supporting. And the Facebook page started attracting negative comments from people calling Patricia out for her behavior rather than the supportive echo chamber she had been hoping to create. Patricia made one last desperate attempt to salvage her campaign by claiming that she was being persecuted for standing up to the wealthy elite, and that I was using my money and power to silence her. But by that point, her credibility was so thoroughly destroyed that even her most loyal supporters were starting to distance themselves from her, and the 3 remaining members of her fictional HOA board all quietly resigned, issuing a joint statement saying they had been misled about the legal status of the HOA and wanted to move forward as regular residents without any governance role. In early October, about 2 months after I had returned to the valley, Patricia and Gerald put their house up for sale and listed it at a price that was significantly higher than what comparable properties in the area were worth, apparently believing that the improvements Patricia had forced on the valley had increased property values despite all evidence to the contrary. The house sat on the market for 4 months, without any serious offers because prospective buyers would research the property online, find all the news articles about the HOA dispute, and decide they didn't want to get involved with such a contentious situation. And eventually, Patricia had to lower the price 3 times before finally finding a buyer willing to take a chance on it. They moved out in February, and I heard through the gossip network that they had relocated to a retirement community in Arizona where there was a proper HOA with hundreds of rules and a full-time management company, which seemed like the perfect place for someone like Patricia who needed structure and authority to feel secure. On their last day in the valley, Gerald stopped by my house to apologize, saying that he had never supported Patricia's HOA crusade but had felt powerless to stop her, and he seemed genuinely remorseful about the trouble she had caused. And I told him I understood and wished them well in their new home, because I'm not the kind of person who holds grudges, and I could see that Gerald had been as much a victim of Patricia's obsession as anyone else. After Patricia left, the valley underwent what I can only describe as a renaissance, a return to the spirit of freedom and mutual respect that had characterized it during my grandfather's time. And it was beautiful to watch. People started personalizing their properties again, painting their houses in colors they actually liked rather than Patricia-approved neutrals, letting their gardens grow a little wilder and more natural, and generally expressing themselves in ways they had been afraid to do when Patricia was watching their every move. The community gatherings at the barn became actual fun events again rather than tense meetings dominated by Patricia's agenda, and people started organizing activities like potluck dinners, movie nights for the kids, and volunteer work parties to maintain the common areas of the valley. Tom Reeves expanded his auto shop and started teaching mechanics classes to teenagers in the valley who were interested in learning a useful skill, and I made sure his lease explicitly allowed for this educational activity so there could never be any question about whether it was permitted. The Johnsons started a community garden in an unused corner of their property and invited everyone in the valley to participate, creating a space where neighbors could work together and get to know each other while growing fresh vegetables. And it became one of the most popular gathering spots in the valley, especially in the summer months when everything was ripe and people would bring their harvests to share at the weekly pot. I also used some of the lease revenue to establish a community fund that residents could apply to for help with emergency expenses or necessary repairs, and we set up a system where residents could volunteer their time and skills to help each other with projects like building repairs, childcare, or elder care, creating a real mutual aid network rather than the top-down control system that Patricia had tried to impose. Several new families moved into the valley after Patricia left, including a young couple who were both artists and who transformed one of the old farmhouses into a studio and gallery space where they displayed their work and taught art classes to valley residents, and a retired park ranger named Bill Henderson who brought decades of knowledge about forest management and fire prevention and organized the valley's first real volunteer fire brigade that actually knew what they were doing, rather than Patricia's version, which had been more about giving her another title and another source of authority than about actual safety. I settled into my role as landlord and steward of the valley, and I found that I loved it in a way I had never loved my previous work, because as much as I had enjoyed traveling the world and working on conservation projects, there was something deeply satisfying about being rooted in one place, knowing every acre of land intimately, watching the seasons change, and being part of a community where people actually knew and cared about each other. I started dating a woman named Sarah Chen, a biologist who worked for the State Forestry Service and who I met when she came to do a survey of the valley's wildlife populations, and we bonded over our shared love of the natural world and our mutual frustration with people like Patricia who wanted to impose suburban aesthetics on rural landscapes that had their own wild beauty. Sarah moved into the Thornwood estate with me about a year after we started dating, and she brought her rescue dogs and her extensive book collection and her infectious enthusiasm for everything from mushroom foraging to stargazing, and the old house that had felt so empty for so long finally felt like a real home again. Ethel Morrison was thrilled to have someone else in the house to fuss over, and she and Sarah became close friends, spending hours in the kitchen together cooking enormous meals and gossiping about valley news and plotting various community improvement projects that they would then convince me to fund or support. Jake Richardson remained my attorney and property manager, but he became much more than that. Over the years he was a mentor, a friend, and eventually the officiant at Sarah's and my wedding 3 years after I returned to the valley, a wedding that we held in the community barn with the entire valley invited, and where even people who had initially supported Patricia showed up to celebrate with us, because the divisions she had created had finally healed, and the community had become what my grandfather had always envisioned, a place where people of different backgrounds and beliefs could live together in freedom and mutual respect. As the years passed, I implemented more of the conservation and sustainability practices I had learned during my travels, working with Sarah to establish wildlife corridors, protect the watershed, and manage the forests in ways that reduced fire risk while preserving habitat for native species. We installed solar panels on the Thornwood estate and several other buildings in the valley, helped residents transition to more efficient septic systems and water conservation practices, and established a valley-wide composting program that reduced waste and provided nutrient-rich soil for gardens. I also worked with the county to have portions of the valley designated as conservation easements, which provided tax benefits while ensuring that the land could never be developed into the kind of suburban sprawl that was encroaching on other rural areas. And I set up a trust that would maintain ownership of the valley after my death and ensure that it would be preserved according to my grandfather's values rather than being sold off to developers or carved up among heirs who might not share our vision. The trust was structured so that residents would have input into management decisions through an advisory council, but the council would have no enforcement power and could not establish rules or regulations without unanimous consent of all residents. making it impossible for another Patricia to hijack the system and impose her will on everyone else. Sarah and I had 2 children, a daughter named Elena and a son named Elijah after my grandfather, and watching them grow up running wild through the valley, playing in the river, building forts in the woods, and learning about the natural world from everyone in the community was one of the greatest joys of my life. And I knew that my grandfather would have been proud to see his legacy continuing not just through the land he had preserved but through the community he had nurtured, and the values he had instilled in me. Sometimes thought about Patricia and wondered if she had found happiness in her HOA-governed retirement community in Arizona, if she had learned anything from her time in Thornwood Valley, or if she was still out there somewhere, trying to control people who didn't want to be controlled. But mostly I felt grateful that she had come into my life when she did, because her attempted takeover of the valley had forced me to come home, to engage with my responsibilities, and to truly appreciate the incredible gift my grandfather had given me. Without Patricia's threat, I might have stayed away for decades, might have lost touch with the valley completely, might have eventually sold the land to someone who would have carved it up and destroyed everything my family had built over generations. And in a strange way, Patricia had saved the valley by threatening it, had forced me to step up and become the steward I was always meant to be. The community thrived in ways it never had before, and Thornwood Valley became known throughout the region as a model for how rural communities could maintain their character and independence while still being welcoming and sustainable. And we started getting visitors from other communities asking how they could replicate our success, how they could resist the pressure to suburbanize and standardize and regulate every aspect of life. I would tell them that it started with respecting people's freedom to make their own choices, trusting them to be good neighbors without needing to enforce that trust through rules and punishments, and being willing to stand up to bullies and tyrants who tried to impose their vision on everyone else. And most importantly, it required having someone who actually cared about the land and the community enough to fight for it when it was threatened. Some communities got it and successfully resisted the HOAification of their areas, while others fell victim to people like Patricia, who were more organized and persistent than the residents who just wanted to be left alone. And I considered us lucky that Patricia had overplayed her hand and made her power grab so obvious and egregious that it united the community against her rather than dividing us permanently. On the 10th anniversary of my return to Thornwood Valley, we held a celebration at the community barn, and over 200 people attended, current residents, former residents who had moved away but stayed in touch, and friends from surrounding areas who had become part of our extended community family. We shared food and stories, and people gave speeches about what the valley meant to them, and several people mentioned the HOA wars, as they had come to be called, always with a mixture of laughter and relief that those days were behind us. And someone had even created a satirical trophy called the Golden Violation Notice, that was awarded each year to whoever had most flagrantly violated the kind of petty rules that Patricia would have enforced. Rules that we now celebrated breaking as a symbol of our freedom. That year's winner was Tom Reeves, who had painted his garage in camouflage pattern because he thought it was funny and because it perfectly represented his refusal to conform to anyone's aesthetic standards. And he accepted the trophy with a speech about how the valley had saved his life by giving him a place where he could be himself, without fear of judgment or harassment. Sarah gave a speech about the ecological health of the valley and how our conservation efforts were paying off with increased wildlife populations and improved water quality. And she credited the community for embracing sustainable practices even when they required extra effort or expense, saying that Thornwood Valley was proof that environmental stewardship and human freedom could coexist when people cared about the land they lived on. I gave the final speech of the evening, and I talked about my grandfather and his vision for the valley, about Patricia and how her attempted takeover had ultimately strengthened rather than divided us, about all the people who had stood up for what was right even when it would have been easier to just go along with her demands, and about my hope that the valley would continue to be a place of freedom and community for generations to come. As I looked out at all those faces, old and young, long-time residents and recent arrivals, people of every background and belief system united by their love for this special place, I felt a sense of gratitude and purpose that went beyond words. And I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, protecting and preserving something precious that had been entrusted to me by the grandfather who had built it and the community that sustained it. The story of Patricia and the HOA became something of a legend in Thornwood Valley, a cautionary tale we told newcomers about what happens when people try to impose control rather than building consensus, when they mistake authority for leadership and compliance for respect. And it served as a reminder to all of us about the importance of defending freedom, even when it would be easier to just follow the rules and keep our heads down. But it was also a story about homecoming, about finding your purpose, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, and about the power of community to overcome division and tyranny. When people come together around shared values and mutual respect, the valley continued to evolve and grow, but it never lost the essential character that my grandfather had established and that I had fought to preserve. And every time I looked out over those 8,000 acres of forest and meadow and river, every time I heard the laughter of children playing freely without fear of violation notices, every time I saw neighbors helping each other without needing rules to compel them, I knew that Patricia's attempt to control what was never hers had failed completely, and that Thornwood Valley would remain a place of freedom, beauty, and community for as long as I had breath in my body to defend it. And I smiled, knowing that the woman who didn't know I owned the entire valley had learned her lesson too late, and that her legacy would be not the ordered kingdom she had tried to build, but the reminder to all of us that true community cannot be imposed from above, but must grow organically from the soil of mutual respect, shared values, and the simple human desire to live in peace with our neighbors and in harmony with the land that sustains us all. The end.